So I'm in my late 20s, and this year I finally got diagnosed with ADHD, and it feels kinda good to know the reason why I cannot keep my apartment tidy without someone threatening to kick in my door every 30 minutes, or why I can't go to the store without headphones without feeling like my head's on fire. But on the other hand, it feels kind of weird, because the last couple of years I've seen such an influx on people on social media talking about ADHD and their struggle with the diagnosis, that it feels like everyone has it. So I started to think, am I gaslighting myself and my psychiatrist into giving me ADHD, or do I actually have it? Because there's no way so many people actually struggle with this. So I wanted to find out, do more people have ADHD now than earlier, or are we just better at diagnosing it? And what I found out is that most people don't even know what ADHD is. But to start understanding ADHD, we have to understand its history. So sit back and relax. I tried to make this as short as I could, and I failed miserably. So ADHD history really starts back with Aristotle and the Bible, but we're not going to go all the way back there because it's all kind of vague and not really relevant. It's all just theories and whatnot. Instead, we're going to start in March 1902, when George Still, a British pediatrician, wanted to roast a group of 43 children in front of the Royal College of London. So George Still drags a group of 43 children in front of the Royal College of London, saying that these kids have what he calls a defect in moral control. He says they're aggressive, they're impossible to discipline, they're prone to fits of passion, they're horrible kids and no one will ever love them, but he also added that they were smart, so you know, balance. But this was the first time in modern history where someone said that, hey, these kids might have a biological disease or a minor brain injury. He did actually say that they might have a brain injury. And it was a fairly radical idea. All the people seeing these lectures thought, that's cool, and just never really touched the topic for a long time. Like almost 30 years later, the next relevant thing happened with Dr. Charles Bradley in Rhode Island that found out that if you give hyperactive children amphetamines, they calm down and focus. Of course, this was way before ADHD, so he thought, cool, and moved on. I was a bit curious what led Dr. Bradley to give children amphetamines in the first place. And turns out that the hospital that Bradley was the medical director for dealt with kids with neurological and behavioral issues, and kids underwent a procedure called pneumocephalography, where they would drain most of the cerebrospinal fluid from around the brain and replace it with air. The goal was to get clear x-rays. But this, of course, led to horrible headaches. So Dr. Bradley thought, maybe if I give these kids Benzedrine, it will affect the blood vessels around the brain and alleviate the headaches. Of course, it didn't work. But you can add to your fun fact toolbox that the reason that we have Adderall today is because a guy in Rhode Island liked to torture kids. But torture aside, Dr. Bradley's little science project was part of the reason we saw the next step of ADHD diagnosing, something called hyperkinetic reaction of childhood in a DSM-2 released in 1968. You see, there was a bit of an ADHD-ish diagnosis outrunning in the 50s and 60s called MBD, or minimal brain dysfunction. Problem is that this wasn't that specific. It would cover everything from hyperactivity to impulsivity to difficulty reading, everything we now know as learning disabilities. It was broad and confusing, and imagine being a parent coming to a doctor saying that my kid has MBD. He would basically become the "you know how little this narrows it down" meme from Batman Beyond. So the researchers writing the DSM-2 used Dr. Bradley's findings as an example to why we need to specify hyperactivity. But Alex, hyperkinetic reaction of childhood, that name sounds very different than ADHD. And yeah, it does. You see, the naming pattern of conditions back in the 60s were a bit weird. Like, hyperkinetic is just hyperactive, you knew that. But reaction of childhood, though? You see, back then there was a psychiatrist, Adolf Meyer, that had established the idea that most mental disorders were not diseases, but reactions of a person's personality to a combination of biological, social, and psychological stressors. Schizophrenia was called schizophrenic reactions, and what we now call anxiety disorders were grouped as psychoneurotic reactions. So a reaction meant it wasn't a neurodevelopmental disorder like we see it as today, it is stored as a child's reaction to their environment, upbringing, and other stress factors. So hyperkinetic reaction of childhood translates to a behavioral response seen in children which is defined by the excessive physical movement. So of children, does that mean that there were no ADHD diagnosis for adults? And yeah, that's exactly what it means. The consensus at the time was once you hit puberty, your brain would mature and you'd be right as rain. And the idea that you would just grow out of it kind of stuck around for decades. So even today, we have adults that have gone around their entire lives thinking that they were just broken. They have been called lazy, disorganized, or having difficult personalities. So yeah, psychiatry in the 60s kind of sucked. But the advantage of the DSM-2 finally acknowledging a hyperkinetic reaction is that we finally got people doing research on what would be ADHD, mainly in the 1970s. For example, the Canadian psychiatrist Dr. Virginia Douglas, one of the heavy hitters when it comes to ADHD research, released her paper Stop, Look and Listen in 1972. She argued that physical hyperactivity wasn't the diagnosis itself, but a symptom of the fact that these kids couldn't sustain attention or control their impulses. Because of her, when the DSM-3 saw the light of day in 1980, the condition was now officially called Attention Deficit Disorder, or ADD with or without hyperactivity. And this was a fundamental shift in the philosophy surrounding ADHD. Since George Still, we've been obsessed with the hyper part, the kids throwing chairs at the teacher. But thanks to Dr. Douglas, the psychiatric world finally admitted that, hey, you can have this problem without running through walls like the Juggernaut in X-Men The Last Stand. And this was huge, because for the first time, the quiet kids that just struggled to pay attention could theoretically get the diagnosis. Theoretically. In reality, it just didn't happen. A 1997 meta-analysis called The Gender Differences in ADHD showed that almost everyone getting sent to the doctors were still just hyperkinetic boys. The medical world wasn't ready. In fact, when the revised DSM-3R was released in 1987, they actually removed ADD without hyperactivity and buried it in a footnote called Undifferentiated ADD. And why? Well, clinicians found it too hard to diagnose. But the real reason, I think, comes from Dr. Russell Barkley, one of the leading experts on ADHD. He argued that ADD without hyperactivity was ignored because it wasn't disruptive to adults. And I just wish that the clinicians that buried ADD without hyperactivity would understand that it was super, super disruptive for the adults that went through life undiagnosed and untreated. Alright, so the 90s. Nirvana was on the radio, flannel was in fashion, houses were affordable, and in 1994 the DSM-4 hit the shelves on medical colleges and universities around the world. This update fixed the glitch and established the holy trinity of ADHD that we have today. We have the hyperactive impulsive kind, or the chair throwers, we have the inattentive type, or the daydreamers, and we got the combined type, the lucky winners that got both. Finally, the quiet ADHD was validated. Doctors started diagnosing kids that they were previously ignored, and naturally when you diagnose more people, you treat more people. So prescriptions for Ritalin skyrocketed. But instead of celebrating this medical breakthrough, what we saw was moral panic, surrounding the idea that we were drugging our kids into obedience. And this was largely due to media. For example, in 1987, a New York Times article points out that nearly half of Georgia's Ritalin prescriptions came from the wealthy white suburbs of Atlanta, where they write, among these people, there is an intense desire to have their child excel, trying to paint Ritalin as academic steroids. But if you look at it logically, did rich people have different brains? No. They didn't even have parents that wanted to drug their kids. Or maybe a few did. But the most important factor is that these rich kids had access. Child psychiatrists weren't always covered by insurance, so low-income families couldn't always afford it. And now imagine a rich, wealthy school with proper funds. If one kid struggles, there's a fairly short school-to-doctor pipeline. In low-income districts, you were told you are stupid, you get detention. So sure, the prescriptions were in the suburbs, but ADHD itself was everywhere. But of course, facts like these didn't matter because the cultural narrative was already set. The Simpsons aired an episode where Bart is diagnosed with ADHD and get put on Focusin, where he ends up as a crazy conspiracy theorist convinced that Major League Baseball has him under surveillance.
You're probably wondering about the coat hangers. They're to block the satellite that's been spying on me.
Of course they did, but that's besides the point. And Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist, famously warned that Ritalin was moving us towards a brave new world of gender-neutral androgyny, convinced that by treating hyperactivity, we were killing the wild spirit of young men. So yeah, according to the Andrew Tates of the late 90s, Ritalin was apparently a feminist plot sent to make sure young men read books and stop failing math. Even South Park, with its Timmy 2000 episode in April 2000, all the kids were put on Ritalin and became zombies that loved Phil Collins and stopped being kids. I think the punchline in the episode is that Ritalin kills childhood and instead you should start beating your kids.
You can either calm down or I can pop you in the mouth again. Thank you.
By the way, have you noticed that there's like one reoccurring thing when you talk about the Ritalin fear and the ADHD diagnosis? It seems to focus only on boys. Where the girls at? And at this point, there was roughly one diagnosed girl for every 10th boy. If you look at these stats in 1995, it seems like ADHD was a boy diagnosis. Like parents were telling their kids, you can't have a neurological diagnosis if you're a girl. And, well, they kind of were doing that. The entire ADHD model has always been built around the hyperactive 7-year-old boy, and to some degree it still is. If you were impulsive and threw chairs at teachers, you were sent to a doctor, but if you were the inattentive type, you got told to pay attention and stop forgetting your homework. In 2023, Epic Research analyzed millions of records and found that diagnosis for adult women has nearly doubled in 3 years. But of course, if you say that to your uncle during Christmas dinner, he will most likely say, they are chasing a trend, or ADHD has become contagious. But this proves the entire point of the video. It's not a trend, it's a correction. So many of ADHD sufferers that have the inattentive type have masked, internalized chaos, worked twice as hard, and smiled to keep it together, often getting good grades as long as they could until they crashed and burned, often around high school age. So while the hypers got Ritalin, the inattentive got nothing. Or worse, they were told they space out a lot and they were just anxious. Dr. Stephen Hinshaw ran a massive longitudinal study on this and found that these people, mainly girls, didn't grow out of it. They hit their 20s and 30s, and when life got too complicated to mask, they burnt out. So when you see thousands of people on TikTok or social media talking about their light diagnosis, they aren't jumping on the bandwagon, they are a lost generation of finally getting found and the help that they deserve. I think we almost covered everything besides one last detail. Because there is one final gatekeeper that is the reason we see an increase in ADHD today, and that is that for decades there was a strict rule that said that to be diagnosed with ADHD, you had to show symptoms before the age of 7. If you struggle at the age of 8, too late, you're just lazy, and for me personally, that was my biggest hurdle. I was born in 96, so I flew under the age 7 rule of the DSM-4, which meant that I managed to surf through school without really touching my homework until high school age. That's when things started to hit me like a brick wall. And even though I struggled in both math and science before that, I was just lazy in my teacher's eyes. And I'm sure that if you've ever been labeled as a gifted kid or smart for your age, you might have experienced a similar reality. But in 2013, the DSM-5 raised the symptom age to 12, and this was a floodgate. Suddenly, millions of people that had held it together until 6th grade were medically valid. So for a lot of people, especially those in their 20s and 30s, the definition of ADHD had finally caught up with their reality. No one caught the disease. There were no food dye that rewired the brain. There's no TikTok that burns people's focus. It was medical progress. So, a little side note, the claim that RFK makes about Red 40 or Allura Red causing ADHD was based on a theory in 1973 by a pediatric allergist, Dr. Benjamin Feingold, that proposed that hyperactivity was caused by artificial food additives and cellulites. He claimed that if you cut these out, you will cure the behavior. This for some reason caught on, but it was debunked in 2007. They found out that for a subset of children, around 8%, it might act like a pharmacological trigger, but it doesn't rewire your brain. ADHD is genetic. Research suggests that the hereditability of ADHD is around 74%, meaning it's about as hereditary as your height. You can't catch it. It's not the flu. Anyway, when I started writing this video, I knew that I had to touch on TikTok and social media. They have to be involved in the increased diagnosis somehow, and it was just not the way that I thought. If you spend 5 minutes on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube Shorts, you've seen a video going, do you lose your keys? Do you doom scroll? Do you have 50 tabs open? Then you have ADHD. And this is a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's Barnum effect, a psychological phenomenon where people believe vague general descriptions apply specifically to them. Everyone loses their keys, everyone gets distracted, doesn't mean you have a neurodevelopmental disorder. It doesn't help either that people hear about the hyperfocus and they have experienced once or twice, and it's usually associated with ADHD, and therefore they think they have it. But hyperfocus is not unique to ADHD, it's not even a medical symptom. That's just something that happens to people. Everyone can get in the zone. But on the other hand, social media is also incredibly efficient as a discovery engine. For the first time in history, people are seeing their internalized struggle described out loud. They are realizing that, wait, not everyone has a brain that screams at them. Social media became a place where people talk about what's wrong with them instead of pretending that everything is okay. And that's something that we really haven't really had before. So I think to answer my own question, is ADHD a trend? I started thinking about glasses. Imagine if glasses were invented today. Like, people still have bad sight, but there's no way to remedy it. People describe that they have bad sight, but people are like, whatever, what can I do about that? But suddenly, we give out the eye test, and we start giving people glasses. Suddenly, the sale of glasses kind of explodes overnight. People are finally getting the help they need. They can finally see. Imagine then if people said that glasses are such a trend. It'd be stupid, right? But that's kind of what we're doing with this ADHD thing. Like, it's not a new trend. It's like always been there. ADHD has just been mislabeled. It's been called moral defect, bad parenting, lazy, difficult personality, stupid, and finally we got the right name. And so many people are finally getting help. Finally someone say, you're living life on hard mode, but you don't have to. And for decades, millions of us lived thinking we were just broken, thinking we were lazy, while everyone else just seemed to manage just fine. And I'm convinced that the historic underdiagnosis of ADHD has cost lives. It has cost careers, it has cost marriages and mental health. So honestly, the numbers doesn't really bother me. They make me angry that it took this long. I don't think we've gone far enough. Like, I'm looking forward to the DSM-6, and I hope we see an even bigger increase in the future. Because that bigger increase doesn't mean we're getting sicker. It means that we are finally stopping the suffering of people struggling with this every single day. Thank you for watching.